The night had a weight to it, the kind that pressed against the chest, heavy with the scent of smoke, damp earth, and the lingering traces of fear. Even the moon seemed hesitant, hiding behind thick clouds as if it feared what might unfold below. In the quiet village that clung to the edge of the forest, life had long been dictated by the unspoken rules of survival. Rules that often whispered of danger, betrayal, and the sharp edge of wolves, both literal and metaphorical. Amid this fragile stillness, she moved. The Omega, delicate in frame yet unyielding in spirit, had always been underestimated, dismissed by villagers and strangers alike. Many called her fragile, some pitied her, but no one knew the fire that burned beneath her soft exterior. Her name, murmured quietly among the homes she passed, carried no weight with the powerful, but with those who truly suffered, it was a promise, a flicker of hope that sometimes, just sometimes, someone would act when the world refused to. It had begun as a whisper in the wind, a child's cry. At first, she thought it was a dream, a trick of the dark, but then the sound grew, insistent, desperate. Through the twisted alleyways and broken wooden fences of the village, she followed it, heart pounding against her ribs as if it sought escape just as urgently as she did. The rogues were already there. Shadows among shadows, they moved with a practiced cruelty, hands rough, eyes cruel, voices like gravel scraping stone. They had cornered the child near the edge of the forest, where the trees leaned close, almost protective, yet powerless against the cold intent of men who had learned long ago that fear was a currency stronger than kindness. She froze for a heartbeat, assessing, calculating. There was no time for hesitation. Omega instincts, those rare, quiet powers whispered of in old tales, coursed through her veins, urging her forward. Every step was deliberate, silent, careful, as if the night itself bent to her will. And then, with the suddenness of a storm breaking against a cliff, she struck, not with brute force, but with precision, with an understanding of balance, leverage, and the fragility of those who underestimated her. The rogues faltered, not expecting the quiet fury of someone they deemed weak. And in that instant, she lifted the child, a boy with wide, terrified eyes and trembling hands, pressing him close to her chest as if shielding him with her very soul. The forest seemed to exhale, leaves whispering encouragement, shadows twisting to conceal their escape. But as the child's sobs quieted, relief turning slowly into trust, a distant sound cut through the night, heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing against the cobblestones, measuring, assessing, commanding. The Alpha King, a man whose name carried authority, whose presence demanded attention, whose gaze alone could unmake kingdoms. Stories said he was ruthless, that mercy was a stranger to him, that his fury was legendary. And now, he was searching for her. Why? That question burned at her mind even as she ran, the child clinging to her, his small hands trembling but gripping with desperate hope. She had acted to save, to protect, and yet she knew the world did not reward such courage when it touched the son of the Alpha King. That simple act, innocent in its intent, now made her a target. The forest swallowed her and the child as she moved, branches clawing at her sleeves, roots threatening to betray her steps, but nothing could slow her. Fear and adrenaline coiled together, fueling her sprint. She could hear the distant shouts now, the unmistakable authority in the Alpha's voice, each word a thunderclap that promised reckoning. Yet, amidst the terror, a strange clarity settled over her. She had saved a life tonight, and for that, no king, no Alpha, no fury of men could erase the truth of her actions. She pressed the child closer, whispering promises she hoped he would believe, while every step carried the unspoken realization that her life had just become irrevocably entwined with a power far beyond her understanding. The night was deepening, darkness pressing closer, but even in shadow, there was a light, faint, fragile, but undeniably there. And in that faint glow, she felt something else stir, a courage born not of recklessness, but of conviction, a strength that might just defy the wrath of a king. The halls of the Alpha's fortress were vast, echoing with the weight of authority and centuries of dominance. Tapestries depicting victories long past hung heavy on the stone walls, and the scent of aged wood and burning torches filled the air. Every step he took reverberated with a resonance that spoke of power and expectation. He was the Alpha King, ruler of lands where fear was law, loyalty was tested, and the consequences of defiance were swift and absolute. Yet tonight, none of his usual concerns, the political alliances, the trade disputes, the endless murmurs of rebellion, held his attention. Tonight it was a child. His son. The memory of the boy's wide eyes, brimming with terror and trust, burned behind his eyelids. The image of that delicate Omega lifting his son from danger, the defiance in her movements, the courage in her stance, ignited a storm of fury within him. That someone so insignificant, so underestimated by the world, had dared to touch what was his, it was unthinkable. And yet, the child was safe, for now. That was the truth the Alpha could not ignore, the truth that clawed at him, reminding him that this was no ordinary pursuit. Outside, the night was alive with whispers of wind and rustling leaves. His guards moved swiftly behind him, forming a silent barrier of strength, yet even their presence could not soothe the rage thrumming through his veins. His senses were attuned to every detail, the faint imprint of footprints in soft earth, the snap of a twig underfoot, the way the shadows shifted unnaturally, as if trying to conceal someone from the world. He had hunted men and beasts alike, tracked fugitives across mountains and rivers, and yet the thought of an Omega, fragile, underestimated, dismissed, evading him ignited a fire that was unlike any he had felt before. Her audacity was infuriating, her skill impressive, her courage reckless. And beneath it all, he sensed something more, something that prickled the edges of his instincts, something that whispered she was not merely an ordinary Omega. He clenched his fists, feeling the tension ripple through his powerful frame. Every instinct screamed that the Omega's survival was a threat, not just to his authority, but to the delicate balance he maintained in his kingdom. And yet, another part of him, the part no one ever admitted existed in the Alpha King, wondered why he was so unsettled by her defiance. There was an unfamiliar pull, something stirring beneath the surface, that he could neither name nor ignore. Through the dark forest, his steps were calculated, precise, each movement a reflection of his unmatched strength and mastery. His mind, always a strategist's mind, ran through possibilities. She could not have gone far. The child would slow her, her fear might betray her location. Every scenario played out like a series of chess moves, yet no amount of prediction could prepare him for the realization that the Omega was not fleeing blindly. She moved with purpose, guided by a resolve that rivaled his own. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional crack of branches or distant call of an owl. The moon broke through the clouds intermittently, casting silver beams that illuminated fleeting glimpses of movement ahead. He paused, sensing a presence, and in that pause, he glimpsed a fleeting shadow darting among the trees, a flicker of motion that spoke of both desperation and determination. His eyes narrowed, heart-hammering not with fear, but with the intensity of the hunt. Yet, beneath the alpha exterior, beneath the rage and the instinct for dominance, there was an acknowledgement, a grudging, quiet acknowledgement, that this Omega was unlike any he had encountered. She was a paradox, delicate yet dangerous, fragile yet unyielding. She had saved his son. She had defied him, and in doing so, she had drawn him into a pursuit that neither would emerge from unchanged. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of her presence, earthy, wild, tempered by a hint of heir and something more elusive, something that tugged at his instincts in a way no mere mortal ever had. He followed it, silent and unrelenting, his focus absolute, every muscle poised for confrontation. This was not merely a hunt, it was a test of wills. A battle that would determine more than survival. It would determine respect, understanding, and perhaps, in ways he did not yet dare to admit, something far deeper. As the forest thickened, the shadows lengthened, and the night deepened, he pressed onward. The child's safety remained paramount, yet the chase had become about more than just reclaiming what was his. It was about facing the unexpected, a force that challenged him, that provoked his dominance, that unsettled the very foundation of what it meant to be alpha. And somewhere ahead, in the darkness between the trees, she ran. Unaware of the thoughts he wrestled with, unaware of the storm she had ignited, she clutched the child closer, moving with the quiet, desperate determination of someone who had nothing to lose but everything to protect. And the Alpha King, fierce and unyielding, followed. The forest had always been a sanctuary of sorts, but tonight, it was a lifeline. Every twisted root, every gnarled branch, every shadowed hollow became her shield as she pressed forward, heart-hammering like a drumbeat in her chest. The child's small frame pressed against her side, trembling, but trusting in her despite the fear that threatened to consume him. She whispered soft reassurances, though the words were as much for her own courage as for his. The moon's light spilled in broken beams through the canopy, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the forest floor, but also revealing patches of danger, loose rocks, hidden roots, and the uneven earth that could betray her every step. She moved carefully, aware that one misstep could be fatal, that the Alpha King's reach was not limited by distance. She had felt it, even before she saw the flashes of power in the shadows, the unmistakable presence of someone trained to hunt, to dominate, to track with inhuman precision. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice carrying across the still night, and for a moment, the sound reminded her of her own solitude. She had always been alone in many ways, dismissed by society, ignored by those who judged strength by size or social power rather than the courage to act. Yet tonight, she realized that solitude was no weakness. It had honed her senses, sharpened her instincts, and prepared her for the impossible. She found a hollowed-out grove, hidden by thick vines and leaning trees, a small clearing that seemed to exist outside the reach of the world. Here, the child could rest, even for a moment, and she could gather her strength. She settled him carefully on a bed of moss, brushing leaves from his hair and letting him curl into her warmth. His eyes were wide, reflecting both exhaustion and awe, and she could feel the tension in his small body begin to ease. Alone, for a few precious moments, she allowed herself to breathe. The forest whispered around her, the wind teasing the leaves like a lullaby, yet in the stillness, her mind raced. She had saved a life, yes, but at what cost? The Alpha King would not forgive this. His fury was legendary, his wrath unrelenting, and yet, there was something more she could not name, a curiosity in his pursuit, a subtle acknowledgement that she had earned his attention. Her thoughts wandered reluctantly to him. The Alpha King was not like the stories told in hushed tones. He was far more terrifying, far more commanding than the legends suggested, yet in the fleeting glimpses she had caught of him during the chase, there had been something else. A measured intensity, a silent awareness that she existed, that she mattered, even if he would never admit it. She shook her head, forcing the thought away. Survival came first. Everything else could wait. But the forest was not entirely safe. Even here, in the quiet of the hidden grove, the Alpha's presence lingered like a shadow she could not shake. She sensed it in the rustle of leaves, in the snap of a distant branch, in the sudden hush of the nocturnal creatures. Her Omega instincts, subtle and mysterious, told her he was close, and with that knowledge came a renewed surge of determination. She would not falter. She could not. The night stretched on, hours passing like breaths held too long. She tended to the child, offering food scavenged from her path, creating a semblance of comfort amidst the chaos. Every sound, every movement beyond the grove, put her on edge. Yet, amidst the fear, a strange resolve took root. She would protect him, no matter what it cost. She had already risked everything once, she would do so again. And somehow, though she could not explain it, she felt that this was only the beginning. As dawn threatened the horizon, the first pale light filtering through the dense canopy, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The forest had given her temporary refuge, yes, but it could not hide her forever. The Alpha King's pursuit would continue. He would find her. And when he did, she knew the encounter would change everything. Her heart tightened with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had survived the night, saved the child, and proven to herself that she could defy the impossible. Yet, deep in her bones, she sensed that the true challenge had not yet begun. The Alpha King was patient, unyielding, and relentless. The hunt was far from over, and the stakes, higher than she could yet imagine, were only beginning to reveal themselves. Somewhere in the approaching light of dawn, she whispered a silent vow to herself and to the child in her care. No matter what came, no matter who hunted her, she would endure. She would survive, and she would protect him, even if the entire world, including the Alpha King himself, rose against her. The forest was changing with the dawn. Sunlight trickled through the dense canopy, scattering golden fragments across the undergrowth, yet the shadows clung stubbornly to every hollow, every crevice, as though aware of the secret they protected. She moved cautiously, the child's small fingers entwined in hers, his trust both a comfort and a responsibility that weighed heavily on her heart. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, yet despite her efforts, an unease coiled in her stomach, a primal warning that danger was near. She had hoped the night's refuge would hold, that the Alpha King would lose the trail, that for just a few hours, perhaps, she could think, rest, and plan. But instinct told her otherwise. The forest spoke to those who listened. The sudden hush of birds, the abrupt stillness of the wind, the way shadows shifted unnaturally along the trunks of the trees, it all told her the hunter had not only survived the night but had closed in. And then, she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, a weight in the air that demanded attention, that pressed against her awareness like an invisible hand. The Alpha King was near. His power radiated through the world subtly but unmistakably, a gravity of authority that even the forest seemed to acknowledge. She froze, pressing the child close, feeling the rapid pulse of his fear against her own heartbeat. The sensation was terrifying, yet thrilling in a way she could not name. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped, soft, almost deliberate. Her head snapped in that direction, eyes scanning the trees, but the forest offered no answer, only the deceptive tranquility of sun-dappled shadows. She knew he was watching, patient, waiting for the smallest mistake, the faintest sign of weakness. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to move calmly, deliberately, knowing that panic would betray them both. The child's small voice whispered, barely audible, "Are they coming?" She stroked his hair, pressing her forehead against his, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. "We're safe, for now," she murmured, though the words felt fragile, like a thin veil stretched over a raging storm. Every instinct screamed that the Alpha's pursuit was relentless, that there was no mistake too small for him to notice, no path hidden enough to evade his reach. Yet, amidst the fear, she felt something strange, a spark of defiance, a stubborn courage that refused to bow. Hours passed like this, a tense balance of stealth and movement, until she came to a small stream cutting through the forest. The water was cool and clear, offering a momentary sanctuary, a brief reprieve from the suffocating tension of the chase. She knelt to let the child drink, using her hands as a cup, and in the reflection of the water, she glimpsed her own face, pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, yet resolute. There was determination there, yes, but also a flicker of something unexpected. Awareness. She realized that this encounter with the Alpha King was not merely about survival, it was shaping her in ways she had never imagined. But the forest was deceptive. The gentle burble of the stream could not drown out the subtle, almost imperceptible sounds behind her, the careful step of something massive and deliberate. Her omega senses flared, warning her before the eyes could confirm. There he was, not just near, but observing, calculating, silent as the shadows themselves. He had found them. She stiffened, pressing the child closer, yet she did not flee. Not immediately. She understood instinctively that running blindly would only give him the advantage. The Alpha King was more than a hunter, he was a strategist, a force of nature who thrived on control and dominance. She had to be clever, deliberate, cautious, but she also had to protect the child, no matter what. For a long moment, she simply waited, listening to the rhythm of the forest, feeling the weight of his presence pressing against her like a storm on the horizon. She could sense him analyzing, assessing, judging not just her movements but her courage, her intent, even her heartbeat. It was unnerving, and yet, she felt alive in a way that fear alone could not explain. Finally, she spoke, softly, though not to him, not yet. "We won't be broken. Not now. Not ever." Somewhere, beyond the trees, the Alpha King's gaze locked onto hers, a silent acknowledgement that the Omega's resolve was far stronger than he had anticipated. His fury remained, but beneath it, there was recognition. He had underestimated her. Perhaps he had even misjudged what it meant to confront her courage. And in that brief, suspended moment between predator and prey, between authority and defiance, the world seemed to pause. The child clung to her, the forest held its breath, and two destinies began to intertwine in ways neither had expected. The hunt was no longer simple pursuit, it had become a dance of power, courage, and something far more complex, something neither the Omega nor the Alpha fully understood. The Alpha King did not advance yet. He did not speak. He waited, as he always did, because control was his nature. And she, the Omega, did not flee. She stood, trembling but unyielding, ready to face the force of a king who hunted not only for vengeance but for recognition, understanding, and perhaps, in ways neither dared admit, something far deeper. The forest was no longer a place of mere refuge, it had become a stage for inevitability. The shadows stretched longer now, the sunlight waning behind the thick canopy, as though nature itself waited with bated breath. She moved cautiously, the child clutching her hand, his trust absolute despite the fear that had etched itself into every line of his small body. Every step was deliberate, each pause a calculated assessment of danger, yet even with her heightened senses, she could feel the Alpha King's presence, unseen, yet overwhelming, like a storm ready to break. And then, she felt it. The air shifted. Not a sound, not a movement, yet the pressure in the space around her changed, the subtle gravity of authority that could bend even the forest to his will. She froze instinctively, pressing the child closer to her side, his warmth grounding her. She knew he was there. He had found them. A sudden rustle to her right made her spin, heart racing. The Alpha King emerged from the shadows with the silence of a predator. His presence alone demanded obedience, yet he made no move to strike. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her, measured her, dissected the courage she wore like armor. Every step he took seemed to press against the world itself, bending it to the inevitability of his will. "You've been clever," he said finally, his voice deep and commanding, reverberating through the clearing. It was not a question, nor a threat, it was a statement. Recognition, grudging though it may have been, hung in the air like smoke. She held her ground, lifting her chin, refusing to show the tremor that threatened her composure. "I won't let him be hurt," she said softly, but with unwavering conviction. Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of unshakable resolve. "No matter who you are." The Alpha's gaze flicked to the child, noting the bond that had formed, the trust, the quiet courage. "You have spirit," he murmured, almost to himself. "Dangerous spirit." He paused, the weight of his authority pressing into the very ground beneath them. "And yet, I cannot forgive what you have done." She knew he meant the act of saving his son. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the stubborn courage that had carried her this far. "I saved him because it was right," she said. "Because I could not let harm come to him. That is all that matters." For a heartbeat, the forest held its breath. The child clung to her, wide-eyed, sensing the tension between two forces that could not be measured in simple terms. The Alpha King's presence was overwhelming, yet there was a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation in him, a recognition that this Omega was no ordinary prey. She did not flee, and that defiance unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He stepped closer, deliberate and controlled, each movement radiating the power he held over the world. And yet, even in the threat of dominance, there was a strange curiosity in his gaze, an assessment that went beyond simple anger or authority. He saw the courage, the heart, the unyielding will of someone who had acted without regard for her own safety. "You could have fled," he said, his tone softer now, almost thoughtful, though the intensity in his eyes remained. "Most would have, yet you did not." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I protect life, no matter who it belongs to. I do not judge by power or title. Only by what is right." A faint shadow of a smile, almost imperceptible, almost human, touched his lips. And in that moment, the Alpha King realized that this Omega was unlike any he had ever encountered. She had challenged him, defied him, yet had done so not out of rebellion, but out of unshakable principle. And principles were not easily defeated, even by a king. The forest seemed to exhale as he considered his next move. There was anger, yes, but also a grudging respect, a recognition that the chase, the hunt, and the fury of a king were complicated now by something he could not fully control. He had come to retrieve his son, to assert his authority, yet in doing so, he had encountered something more powerful than fear or obedience, courage. The Omega pressed the child closer, sensing the subtle tension in his pursuer, aware that any misstep could be fatal. And yet, she did not falter. This confrontation, terrifying as it was, had revealed something profound, that she could stand against even the most powerful force in the world and still protect what mattered most. For a long, tense moment, neither moved. The forest held its breath, the air thick with anticipation. And then, almost imperceptibly, the Alpha King stepped back, lowering the invisible weight of dominance just enough to acknowledge the reality he could not deny. This Omega had earned his attention, his recognition, and perhaps, in ways neither dared admit, his respect. The first confrontation had ended, not with victory, nor defeat, but with the unspoken understanding that their paths were now entwined. The hunt was far from over, but the dynamics had shifted. The Omega had proven her courage, and the Alpha King had glimpsed the impossible, the strength of someone who refused to bow. As he disappeared back into the shadows, her heart still racing, she realized something profound. The battle was not just for survival anymore. It was for trust, for recognition, and perhaps for something deeper, something neither had yet allowed themselves to aim. The forest returned to silence, but in that silence lay the promise of change, the kind that could not be stopped, the kind that would alter destinies forever. The forest had grown quiet in the aftermath of their confrontation, but silence offered no comfort. She moved cautiously, feeling the child's small hand tremble in hers, guiding him with a firm yet gentle grip. Every shadow seemed heavier now, every sound amplified, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, even the distant call of a bird that had somehow survived the tension of the night. Her senses were sharpened, attuned not only to danger but to subtle cues that might betray their pursuer. The Alpha King had vanished into the shadows after their encounter, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud. She could sense it in the weight of the air, in the way the forest seemed to hold itself still, and even in the child's quiet, uneasy breaths. The knowledge that he was near, watching, analyzing, calculating every movement she made, created a tension that tightened around her chest like a vice. For hours, she navigated the twisting paths of the forest, seeking refuge in places only she could find, hidden hollows beneath roots, dense thickets that swallowed her form, shallow caves concealed by moss and overgrowth. Each step was careful, measured, yet beneath the careful movements, there was a simmering awareness that the Alpha's pursuit was not merely about reclaiming his son. There was something else in his gaze, something she could not yet name, something that made her pulse quicken in a mixture of fear and an unexpected, unbidden curiosity. He was relentless. She knew it. She could feel it in the subtle shifts of the forest, in the weight of unseen eyes tracking their path, in the sudden hush that fell over the creatures of the night. The Alpha King did not pursue blindly. He analyzed, anticipated, and adapted, matching her every effort with patience and strategy. And yet, in that very pursuit, there was a strange fascination, a tension that seemed to grow with every passing moment. He had underestimated her once, and now he was forced to reconsider not only her courage but her skill, her resolve, and her unyielding heart. She stopped at the edge of a narrow stream, the water reflecting the fading light of the sun in fractured diamonds across the surface. She knelt, letting the child drink and resting briefly herself, but even in that quiet, the sense of being watched never left. She could feel the Alpha King's presence, like a shadow stretching across the forest toward her, silent and immovable. "Why do you persist?" she whispered into the stillness, more to herself than to anyone else. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of exhaustion, fear, and defiance all at once. Why does he follow so relentlessly? The answer, she suspected, was more than simple anger or the protection of his son. She could sense it in the way he had paused during their first confrontation, the faint hesitation, the subtle acknowledgement of her courage. There was an obsession forming, one born not of malice, but of something far more dangerous, curiosity, fascination, and the stirrings of respect that he would never admit aloud. She pressed onward, the child close, her mind working tirelessly. She had learned to read the forest like a map of her own life, every branch and root a guide, every shadow a clue. And yet, no amount of skill could prepare her for the realization that the Alpha King's pursuit was as much about understanding her as it was about reclaiming his son. He sought her, not merely to assert dominance, but to uncover the nature of the Omega who had dared defy him, who had saved the boy, who had challenged the very notion of power itself. Hours became a tense blur as they moved deeper into the forest. She found brief pockets of safety, concealed by overgrowth and natural formations, yet the knowledge that he was always nearby created a constant undercurrent of tension. Each night, as darkness fell, she would catch fleeting glimpses, shadows that moved with precision, the occasional glint of armor, the sound of controlled footsteps that betrayed the Alpha King's approach. He was patient, calculating, and utterly relentless. And yet, with every encounter, every close observation, the dynamics began to shift. His anger was still present, simmering beneath the surface, but there was something else emerging, something neither fully understood. He respected her courage, her determination, the strength of her will. He observed not just the protection of his son, but the choices she made, the risks she took, the unwavering principle that guided her actions. She felt it too, though she could not yet name it. A tension, palpable and electric, threaded through their interactions. Fear mingled with admiration, caution with a reluctant fascination. She did not trust him, not yet, but she could sense that the man who pursued them with such fury was no longer merely a hunter. He was a force becoming entwined with her destiny, and with the child's, in ways she could not yet anticipate. Night fell again, wrapping the forest in a cloak of shadows, and she pressed closer to the child, murmuring soft promises of safety. Yet even as she moved, she could feel the Alpha King's gaze across the distance, patient and unyielding, an invisible thread pulling them toward a confrontation that would change everything. The chase had become a test of endurance, courage, and wits. But beneath the tension, beneath the fear, there was a subtle undercurrent, an acknowledgement of something more than survival. The Omega had proven her strength, and the Alpha King's obsession had shifted from pursuit to fascination, from anger to grudging respect, from dominance to something far more complex. And in the quiet of the forest, as shadows deepened and the night whispered promises of confrontation, she realized the truth. This was no longer merely a hunt. It was the beginning of a bond forged in fire, fear, and courage. A bond that neither could yet define, but one that would inevitably shape their fate. The forest had grown darker, thicker, as if it sought to hide the truths that were about to surface. The air was heavy, dense with the scent of earth, moss, and the faint metallic tang of fear that clung to her skin. She moved cautiously, guiding the child with steady hands, each step measured, silent. But she knew, could feel it deep in her bones, that the Alpha King had narrowed the distance. He was no longer just near, he was imminent, a shadow pressing close, relentless and unstoppable. For days, she had relied on her instincts, her knowledge of the forest, and the child's trust to evade him. She had found temporary sanctuaries, hidden nooks, and secret paths that only she could navigate. Yet the inevitable truth remained. A man like him could not be outrun indefinitely. His presence was not simply force, it was calculation, patience, and authority manifest, and it followed her with the inevitability of a storm. The first sign of his proximity came as a subtle shift in the wind, a sudden hush among the birds, and the faintest disturbance of the undergrowth. Her Omega senses flared immediately, and she froze, heart-hammering, gripping the child tightly. She could sense him, just beyond the trees, observing, calculating, waiting for her next move. His patience was infuriating, yet she could not deny the thrill it sent through her, a dangerous spark of tension that made every nerve alive with awareness. Then, he appeared. Not in a rush, not with a clash of armor or the roar of command. He simply emerged from the shadows, tall, imposing, and impossibly controlled. The sunlight, now fractured through the dense canopy, glinted faintly off the lines of his armor, accentuating his presence like a force of nature itself. The Alpha King's gaze locked onto hers, sharp, unyielding, demanding obedience while simultaneously testing the courage that radiated from her. "You cannot hide," he said, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of authority. "It was not a question. It was a fact. The child is mine, and your interference will not be tolerated." She stood her ground, chest rising and falling, eyes steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "You cannot control everything," she replied quietly, though her voice held steel beneath its softness. "Not life, not courage, not love. I protect what matters." The child clutched her side, sensing the intensity of the confrontation, but she pressed him closer, offering warmth and reassurance through her embrace. Her heart pounded, yet beneath the fear, a stubborn determination held fast. She would not flee. She would not submit. She had survived every challenge until now, and she would survive this. The Alpha King stepped closer, slow, deliberate, each movement radiating dominance yet tempered by a subtle, almost imperceptible curiosity. He was not merely confronting her, he was studying her, assessing the courage and strength that had allowed her to defy him at every turn. His fury, though present, was laced with fascination, a recognition that she was far more formidable than appearances suggested. "You are reckless," he said, tone hardening. "But impressive." His eyes flicked to the child and back to her. "You risk everything for him." "I risk everything for what is right," she answered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Not for power. Not for authority. For life. For love. That is why I stand here." A tense silence fell over the forest, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint murmur of a hidden stream. For the first time, the Alpha King paused fully, taking measure not just of her physical presence, but of her spirit, the unyielding, unbroken essence that refused to bow. He realized, reluctantly, that this Omega was not merely a victim or a prey to be subdued. She was a force, a challenge, something that defied the order he had always maintained, and yet, something that stirred an awareness within him he could not name. The child pressed closer to her, his small voice trembling but firm. "Please, don't fight." She smiled softly at him, brushing hair from his forehead. "I will not let him harm you," she promised. "Not now. Not ever." The Alpha King's gaze softened ever so slightly, though only in the briefest flicker of acknowledgement. He did not lower his authority, did not abandon his role as hunter and protector of his son, but the tension in his stance shifted subtly. She had earned more than his attention, she had earned his respect, however unspoken, however reluctant. "You are extraordinary," he said finally, voice quiet, almost admiring, yet edged with warning. "Do not mistake respect for weakness. One misstep, and the consequences will be severe." She nodded, understanding the gravity of his words, yet unwavering in her resolve. "I do not fear consequences when protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The forest seemed to hold its breath, the space between them charged with anticipation, tension, and something unspoken that neither could yet name. The Omega had survived the cornering. The Alpha had recognized her strength. And in that fragile, suspended moment, the rules of pursuit and dominance began to shift. The confrontation ended not with battle, but with understanding, mutual, grudging, and dangerously magnetic. They had reached a precipice. The child was safe for now, yet the inevitable dance between courage and authority, protection and dominance, had only begun. And in the shadows of the forest, the Alpha King lingered, watching, waiting, his obsession tempered with admiration, his pursuit now as much about understanding her as reclaiming what was his. The Omega remained steadfast, aware that the path forward was perilous, but fortified by the knowledge that she had not only survived, but had stood unbroken in the face of a king. The edge of destiny had been reached, and nothing, neither fear, fury, nor fate, would be the same again. The forest had grown quieter now, but the silence was not comforting. It was deliberate, almost expectant, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath for what was about to unfold. She moved carefully, the child clinging to her side, his small hand warm in hers. Her senses were alert, every sound, every movement analyzed, yet beneath the caution there was a strange sense of inevitability, a knowing that the Alpha King's pursuit was no longer about simple capture. Something else had begun to emerge, subtle but undeniable, a fragile thread of trust. The child stirred, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Is he gone?" he asked softly, voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. She shook her head gently, pressing a finger to his lips. "Not gone," she whispered. "Just watching. But I promise, he won't hurt you. Not while I'm here." Even as she spoke, she could sense him. The Alpha King was not close enough to strike, yet his presence was unmistakable, a weight in the air that pressed against the edges of her awareness. He observed, always observing, calculating, yet there was no immediate aggression. It was as though he understood, perhaps for the first time, that this Omega was not an ordinary target, that she could not simply be subdued or coerced. Her courage, her principles, the protective force she radiated toward the child, all of it demanded acknowledgement. She led the child to a small clearing beside a gentle stream, sunlight flickering across the surface in scattered diamonds. She let him drink, letting the cool water wash away some of the fear clinging to him. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let the tension ease, however slightly. But the forest offered no guarantees. She knew the Alpha King would not give up the hunt entirely, not when the child was his, and not when she had proven herself both capable and defiant. Yet, in the quiet, she began to notice subtle changes. The rustle of leaves was no longer entirely threatening. The faint snap of a twig did not immediately trigger panic. She sensed him, always there, but not as a looming predator in this moment. It was as if the hunt had evolved into something else. Something precarious. Something that balanced between caution, respect, and an unspoken recognition of each other's strength. He stepped into the clearing finally, tall and imposing, yet without the immediacy of attack. His presence radiated authority, yes, but also a measured restraint, as though he were testing boundaries, gauging limits. "You are persistent," he said, voice deep and calm, cutting through the quiet. "And, remarkably capable." She met his gaze, unflinching, though her heart raced. "I protect what is precious," she replied softly, the weight of her conviction anchoring her voice. "I do not yield, nor will I compromise for fear or authority." A silence fell again, thick and charged, as he regarded her. For the first time, she noticed a subtle shift in his posture, not dominance alone, but an acknowledgement of equality, in some form, however tentative. "You are unlike anyone I've ever encountered," he admitted finally, the words low, deliberate. "Most would have fled, or faltered, or succumbed to fear. You do not." Her chest rose with a quiet steadiness, though inside her heart thrummed a mixture of caution, relief, and curiosity. "I do not fear when life is at stake," she said simply. "I have nothing to gain, yet everything to protect. That is why I stand." He considered her, gaze sharp yet softened ever so slightly by the flicker of recognition. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there is more to courage than I understood." The child tugged gently at her sleeve, looking between them with innocent eyes. Are we safe?" he asked. She knelt to his level, brushing hair from his forehead, and whispered, "For now, yes. For now, we are safe. But we must be careful, always." The Alpha King remained standing, observing the delicate balance between the Omega and her charge. He did not move closer, yet there was a tension in the space between them, charged with unspoken acknowledgement. The hunt had shifted. It was no longer a matter of mere capture or retribution. It was a test of trust, courage, and the unspoken understanding that neither would yield easily. Hours passed in cautious stillness. The Omega kept the child close, tending to him, offering comfort, while the Alpha remained nearby, a silent guardian and observer. Neither fully trusted the other, yet each recognized the necessity of this fragile truce. Their eyes met occasionally, brief glances laden with awareness, respect, and an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that neither dared to name yet, but that hovered between them like the forest mist. At dawn, as night approached, she guided the child to a concealed hollow for rest, careful to keep their position hidden. The Alpha King lingered at the edge of the clearing, a silent sentinel, his presence both protective and commanding. For the first time, the Omega allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement. He was not merely an enemy or a threat. He was a force, yes, but also a guardian in his own relentless way, and in this moment, that complexity became undeniable. The forest whispered around them, shadows deepening, and in that suspended quiet, a fragile trust began to form, not complete, not unwavering, but present. It was a bond forged in danger, courage, and mutual recognition. And as she held the child close, feeling the steady rhythm of his breaths, she realized that the next steps, though uncertain and perilous, would be guided not just by fear, but by a growing awareness that even in the midst of pursuit, connection could take root. The night settled over the forest like a velvet shroud, and the Omega understood the truth. Survival alone was no longer the measure of courage. Trust, even fragile and dangerous, was the next challenge. And the Alpha King, patient and watchful, had begun to teach her that some bonds, born in fire, forged in danger, could never be broken, no matter the trials to come. The forest had shifted into a different rhythm. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and earth, but also the lingering tension of pursuit and unspoken truths. She moved with a quiet confidence now, the child's hand in hers, their steps carefully measured along paths only she could navigate. Gone was the panic that had once dominated her flight. In its place was a clarity born from endurance, courage, and the subtle knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. The Alpha King followed, always just beyond the reach of sight, but no longer with the single-minded fury of a hunter. His presence pressed into the forest like a living weight, commanding yet restrained, powerful yet observant. He did not close in immediately, not yet, as if understanding that this was a delicate dance requiring patience. His gaze lingered on her, not with anger now, but with something far more complex: fascination, grudging respect, and an unspoken acknowledgement that the Omega before him was a force to be reckoned with. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider him, not as a threat, not merely as the king pursuing her in her charge, but as a being of immense strength and discipline, someone capable of both immense fury and careful, calculated restraint. He had watched her, analyzed her, and yet had not forced the inevitable confrontation. His patience, while infuriating, was also a revelation. It suggested that there was more to his pursuit than anger. The child, small and trusting, clung to her side as they reached a secluded grove. She knelt to let him drink from the stream, watching the sunlight flicker across the water, reflecting in his wide, innocent eyes. "We're safe here, for now," she murmured. The words were not mere reassurance. They were a vow, an unshakable promise she intended to keep. Even as she spoke, the Alpha emerged from the shadows of the trees. His presence was commanding, yet restrained, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle tension in his posture, a mixture of authority and something softer, almost protective. He did not step forward aggressively, he simply observed, studying the delicate balance she maintained between courage and caution. "You've endured much," he said, voice low, resonant, carrying a weight that demanded acknowledgement. "And yet, you continue to protect what matters most, despite the danger." She met his gaze steadily. "I protect life," she said. "Because it is right. Because fear does not govern me. Because love and duty outweigh power and authority." For a heartbeat, he simply regarded her, the forest holding its breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "there is more to strength than I realized. And more to courage than I have witnessed in years of rule." The tension between them softened, though only slightly, leaving a delicate thread of understanding in its place. The Alpha King had learned, reluctantly, that this Omega was unlike anyone he had encountered. She was resilient, principled, unyielding in the face of danger, and utterly devoted to protecting the innocent. In her, he had glimpsed a force that challenged his assumptions, defied his dominance, and yet drew him toward her in ways he did not fully comprehend. The child leaned against her, and she brushed his hair from his forehead, murmuring a soft promise. "We will face whatever comes together," she whispered, almost to herself, yet aware that he could hear every word. He did not respond immediately, but she felt his presence shift closer, almost imperceptibly, like a silent sentinel ensuring their safety. It was in that moment, suspended in the quiet of the forest, that she understood a crucial truth. The Alpha's pursuit was no longer about reclaiming authority. It was about understanding her, guarding what she protected, and witnessing courage in its purest form. Night fell slowly, wrapping the forest in a veil of shadow, and she guided the child to a hidden hollow for rest. The Alpha lingered at the edge of the clearing, his watchful presence both comforting and intimidating. In the quiet hours, she felt a subtle connection forming, a bond forged not through words, but through shared endurance, mutual respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement of strength. The dangers of the world had not disappeared. The child remained vulnerable, and the Alpha King's authority remained absolute. Yet, within the forest, in the delicate balance between fear and trust, they had discovered something far more profound: the beginnings of a bond that could withstand fury, opposition, and uncertainty. A bond that, if nurtured carefully, might evolve into something neither expected, but both could not deny. As dawn approached, light spilling in fragmented beams through the dense canopy, she held the child close and allowed herself a quiet, fleeting smile. The Alpha King, ever watchful, observed from the shadows, his presence a steady weight, a reminder of power, but also of an unspoken alliance forming between them. The hunt was over, but the journey was far from complete. Trust had been sown, courage had been tested, and the fragile bond between them, Omega and Alpha, protector and guardian, had begun to take root. And in that moment, amidst the shadows and light of the forest, they understood that their destinies were now entwined in ways that neither could escape, nor wished to. The forest was bathed in the gentle light of dawn, golden rays spilling through the canopy, illuminating the dew-laden leaves with a soft shimmer. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine, earth, and a quiet promise of renewal. After nights of relentless pursuit, whispered fears, and tenuous truces, there was a rare, almost sacred stillness. It was as if the forest itself acknowledged that the storm had passed and that a fragile peace had been earned. She stood at the edge of the clearing, the child nestled safely in her arms, his small breaths steady and calm. The tension that had gripped her for so long, the constant, suffocating fear, had eased just enough to allow a measure of relief. For the first time in days, she felt the weight of exhaustion, not from the chase itself, but from the emotional toll of holding life, responsibility, and courage in her hands simultaneously. Behind her, the Alpha King emerged slowly from the shadows. There was no need for words, no need for threats. His presence alone carried authority, strength, and the unspoken acknowledgement that this chapter of pursuit had ended. He observed her quietly, his gaze steady and unwavering, yet softened by a newfound respect and understanding. "You have kept him safe," he said finally, voice low but clear, resonating with the weight of command tempered by recognition. "I see now, you are more than I ever imagined." She looked up at him, holding the child close, and met his gaze without fear. "I only did what needed to be done," she said simply. "Because someone had to. Because courage is not measured by power, but by the willingness to act for those who cannot protect themselves." He studied her for a long moment, the depth of his assessment revealing a side few had ever seen. The Alpha King, ruler and hunter, was captivated not by defiance alone, but by integrity, principle, and the quiet, unyielding strength that had guided her through peril. In her, he had found an equal, not in authority, not in dominion, but in courage and heart. The child stirred in her arms, yawning softly. She smiled down at him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice tender yet firm. "Nothing will harm you again. Not him. Not anyone." The Alpha King stepped closer, maintaining a respectful distance, yet the warmth in his eyes was undeniable. "No one will," he said quietly, almost as if making a promise to both of them. "I will ensure it." For a long, suspended moment, the three of them stood in silence, the forest embracing the quiet as if nature itself celebrated the survival, courage, and the bonds that had been forged in fire. The chase was over, the fear replaced by vigilance tempered with trust, and the dangers that had once loomed so large were now tempered by understanding and alliance. The Omega gently set the child down on a soft patch of moss, allowing him to stretch and take tentative steps. He laughed softly, the sound like sunlight itself, pure and unburdened, and she felt a swell of warmth in her chest. In that laughter, she heard the echoes of nights survived, dangers overcome, and a promise of future days unmarred by fear. The Alpha King's gaze softened further, the intensity of command giving way to something more human, more real. He approached slowly, stopping just a respectful distance away. "You've changed more than this forest," he said quietly, voice carrying an edge of wonder. "And perhaps, you've changed me as well." She looked at him, understanding dawning that the tension, fear, and pursuit had given way to something unexpected: respect, trust, and the beginnings of connection deeper than either had anticipated. "Perhaps," she replied softly, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "But the important thing is that we move forward, together." He nodded, a rare, subtle smile brushing across his lips, a gesture that spoke of authority tempered by empathy, dominance tempered by understanding. "Together," he echoed, the words solidifying an unspoken promise that transcended fear, power, and past pursuit. The child ran ahead, giggling, his small feet kicking up soft clouds of earth as he explored the clearing. She followed, hands still gently brushing his back, and felt the Alpha's presence close, protective, but non-intrusive. The bond that had been forged in danger, through trials, fear, and endurance, now had the chance to flourish in safety and trust. The forest seemed to breathe with them, sunlight streaming fully through the canopy, casting a golden glow that felt like a blessing. They were survivors, an Omega, an Alpha, and a child bound not just by circumstance, but by courage, protection, and the slow-building trust that had blossomed into connection. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel peace. The hunt was over. The danger had passed. And in the warmth of the morning light, with the child laughing at her side and the Alpha King watching protectively yet respectfully, she understood that their story was no longer defined by fear or pursuit, but by hope, trust, and the promise of a future they could share. The first light of morning seeped through the dense canopy, spilling in golden shafts across the forest floor. Each droplet of dew caught the sun, glimmering like tiny stars scattered across the moss-covered earth. The night of fear, relentless pursuit, and unyielding tension was behind them now. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe freely, though the weight of what had passed lingered in the muscles of her back, the tension in her shoulders, and the quiet echo of her racing heartbeat. The child slept peacefully in her arms, his small body light and trusting, completely unaware of the storm that had raged around him. She had carried him through danger, had shielded him from the world's cruelty, and in doing so had discovered a courage she had never known she possessed. The bond between them had become a tether of survival, trust, and unconditional love, a connection that anchored her, even amidst chaos. From the edge of the clearing, a tall, imposing figure emerged. The Alpha King moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, but his eyes betrayed a softness reserved for moments like this. Moments when awe, respect, and unspoken admiration mingled beneath his imposing exterior. He had tracked them, pursued them, challenged her, and yet he had also come to witness the unbreakable spirit of the Omega who had dared defy him, who had risked everything to protect what mattered most. "You've endured everything," he said, voice low, calm, yet edged with gravity. "And yet, you stand unbroken. More than that, you have proven a strength that few can claim." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze steadily, and the weight of her journey reflected in her eyes. "I had no choice," she admitted softly. "I acted because it was right. Because there were lives depending on me. Because I could not stand by and watch innocence be destroyed." He studied her, the depth of his gaze acknowledging everything she had endured, the fear, the courage, the relentless determination that had kept them alive. "And in doing so," he said, tone quiet, deliberate, "you have not only saved him, but you have changed the course of this day, perhaps even my understanding of strength itself." The child stirred, blinking sleepily, and she smiled down at him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "It's over now," she murmured. "You're safe. We are safe." For the first time, the Alpha King stepped closer, his presence both commanding and protective. The tension that had defined their interactions, the chase, the confrontation, the struggle of dominance, was gone, replaced by an unspoken understanding. He did not approach as a hunter approaching prey, but as a guardian acknowledging courage, a king acknowledging a force of nature that had challenged him in ways he could not ignore. "You have my word," he said quietly, his tone firm yet carrying an almost gentle weight, "that nothing will harm him. And nothing will harm you, either." She allowed herself a small, exhausted smile, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "I never sought protection," she admitted softly. "But I accept it now. Because it comes from someone who understands what it means to stand for life, for love, and for what is right." The forest itself seemed to breathe with them, the rustle of leaves, the soft babble of the stream nearby, the distant call of a bird, all harmonizing into a quiet symphony of peace. The shadows that had haunted their journey were gone, replaced by the warm embrace of sunlight, spilling fully across the clearing and illuminating their faces with golden clarity. The child ran ahead, laughing freely now, tiny feet kicking up soft clouds of forest debris. She watched him, heart swelling, and felt the Alpha's presence beside her, steady, watchful, yet unintrusive. He observed the bond she shared with the child, the courage and care woven into every movement, and something in his posture softened even further, a rare, subtle acknowledgement that power and respect, dominance and admiration, could coexist when tempered by trust. "You've done more than survive," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You've shaped the world around you. And in doing so, you've shaped me." She looked at him, understanding dawning that the hunt, the pursuit, the danger, and the confrontation had led to something neither had expected, a bond forged in fire, tempered by courage, and strengthened by mutual recognition. "And you've done the same for me," she replied softly. We've both endured, both protected, and both learned to trust. For a long moment they simply stood there, three figures bound by circumstance, courage, and now trust. The Omega, the Alpha, and the child who had unknowingly become the catalyst for their connection. The forest, the witness to so much fear and fury, now bore witness to something entirely new: understanding, peace, and the fragile beginnings of love. The Alpha King extended a hand, not as a threat, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement of shared strength and mutual respect. She placed her hand in his, steady and unflinching, and in that simple gesture, the weight of the past, the tension of pursuit, and the trials of the journey all fell away. They were no longer hunter and prey, pursuer and fugitive. They were partners in survival, guardians of life, and the architects of a future that held promise beyond fear. The sun rose fully, spilling warmth and light across the forest, gilding the leaves and casting long, soft shadows. The child laughed again, running ahead into the open, free from the threat that had once loomed over them. She watched him, heart full, and felt the Alpha King's hand brush briefly against hers in silent solidarity. For the first time in years, the world felt whole, safe, and alive with possibility. The hunt was over. The dangers had passed. And in the light of this new dawn, the Omega and the Alpha understood that what they had forged together, a bond built in courage, tempered by trust, and anchored in love, was stronger than any fear, stronger than any threat, and enduring enough to face whatever future might come. The forest whispered around them, the wind carrying the promise of new beginnings. And in that serene, golden morning, the Omega, the Alpha, and the child stepped forward together, not as pursuer and prey, not as hunter and fugitive, but as a family bound by courage, protection, and the unbreakable ties of heart and trust.